Hey guys, Jeremy here with Simple Little Life and welcome to another edition of Tool Time Tuesday. This week I'm going to show you a tool that I just made called a belt slitter. What does it do? Well, essentially all it does is take a 2-inch wide belt, in my case I have 2x72 belts for my grinders and stuff, and it cuts them very quickly, very cleanly and evenly right down the middle, so you end up with two 1-inch by 72 belts. It's really handy, especially when you're using a horizontal grinder. When I was doing the research to make my horizontal grinder, I was looking around and I pretty much had my grinder built, and then it kind of clicked on me. I thought, I wonder if Beaumont makes a horizontal grinder, and sure enough they do. They make one and you can actually adapt it for 72-inch belts, and they showed cutting the belt in half. They said, you know, with these horizontal grinders, cut the belt in half because then you can move it up and down your entire like small wheel assembly and stuff and use more of that belt. Makes a lot of sense because when you're using the horizontal grinder, especially when you're just, you know, doing choils and shaping the blank, you're only grinding on whatever the thickness of your blade is. So sometimes it's just a 1/4 inch and that part gets worn down really quickly, and you're limited to how much you can move your belt up and down. Otherwise you'll start hitting the edges of the small wheel holder. So it makes a lot of sense to cut your belts in half, and it works absolutely fantastic. I can actually move this thing down, up and down the entire way so that my work rest is here, and I can use this whole belt without ever interfering with the small wheel holder or any other attachments like that. Also, one other reason that I do like to cut my belts, and I've always used my old grinding belts for hand sanding. For the past 3 years, I mean, it works really well for me. I was recently looking at buying a shop roll of like emery cloth, sandpaper, stuff like this, and these things are like $30 for a 50-foot roll. So if I take a 72-inch belt, that's 6 feet that I can still use, especially the coarser grits. Once they don't grind so well, they work really good for hand sanding. And if I split that in two, now I've got 12 feet of basically emery paper, emery cloth from an old belt that otherwise would be thrown out. So I think it's a really good idea. It works really well. I'll show you it real quick. It's a very, very simple thing. All this is I've taken a piece of shafting and I machined the center down simply so that I could have a shoulder on each side. And this is 2 inches in between here. And what that allows me to do is simply place the belt in there and keep a nice snug wrap on here, and that will help guide it and keep it straight. And then I've simply cut a groove in here, a slot on my bandsaw, and then I drilled and tapped a 1/4 screw that presses and holds this little piece of a razor blade. I just break off the tip of a razor blade and lock that in there. And now that's exactly 1 inch, and I just sit my belts in there and boom, like that, you've got two 72-inch by 1-inch belts. Really slick. I'll show you the grinder. I'll kind of explain how it works exactly, and then also I'll go ahead, and the end of this video is going to be some quick build footage. I shot footage on the whole thing. I'm not going to go into too much details, but real quickly, if you're doing this yourself, maybe you didn't have access to a lathe or something, you could always do this out of a nice piece of wood doweling maybe. I don't necessarily know how you drill and tap, but you can drill and tap wood, and you know, if you've got all these threads in there, I'm sure you could get enough pressure to hold a blade in place, and then you could simply make a couple other pieces of wood like donuts, just bore a hole in a piece of plywood and put plywood guides on either side like that. Anyways, if you kind of use your creativity, this is basically what I want to share today, this basic idea right here. This thing works really awesome, and let's take a look. All right, so first let's take a look at the grinder. As you can see, I've got the 1-inch belt on here, and I've got room that I can run this all the way up to the top of the wheel, and that will come roughly right in line with the very bottom of my work surface. And then I can also run it down right to the very bottom of the wheel here, and that lines up with the top edge of my work surface. So essentially, if my work surface is sitting right here, I can move this belt entirely above it or entirely below it, and that allows me to use this whole belt and wear out this thing evenly, rather than, say, if I had a 2-inch belt here, I could come up maybe a 1/4 of an inch before I'd start rubbing on these parts, and I could go down about a 1/4 inch before I could start rubbing on the bottom. You see there's a few little scuff marks on the bottom. I'm not sure if that'll show up or not, but really with a 2-inch belt I'm kind of limited, and I certainly cannot utilize the entire surface of the belts that I buy. So really, really handy if you have a horizontal belt grinder. And I'll put the tool rest on here, I'll fire it up, and I'll show you the tracking, exactly how it works and how you can utilize this entire belt area. All right. Okay, so I'll fire it up here. Now you see I've got it actually above the surface of my work table there. So if I'm grinding choils in a knife or something like that, I can start on the bottom, and as that part gets worn down, I can simply move my belt lower and lower and lower. And that's actually my tracking wheel touching the table. That's not the belt riding on the bottom yet. So you see how much of that I can use, and then as it's getting worn out, I can simply move it up, move it up, move it up. And voila, I've got the entire belt used, and I can get it well worn out before I have to throw it in the garbage. All right, so that grinding noise that you heard was actually this tracking tensioning wheel riding on the base of the grinder here. Now when I designed it all for 2" by 72 belts, and I've got enough tracking with a 2" belt on there. In fact, if I start going down too far, the 2" belt will rub on the bottom plate of my small wheel holder here. So I do have to watch out for that, as well as I can run it right up into the top plate of the wheel holder here. And had I known that I'd be using 1" belts, I might have done a little more fiddling around and given myself a little bit more tracking to bring this whole thing down. Having said that, I've got a modification already that I'm seriously debating whether I should do it or not. It has to do with putting another slightly larger wheel on this side and a pivot in the middle, so I can quickly switch between say like a 2" wheel, or sorry, I think it's a 1.5" wheel, and my small wheel holder, and it would simply swivel and lock in place. If that's the case, I'll actually need to raise this up about 1/2 inch, and everything would go up as well, and that would completely alleviate this problem with me not being able to get this belt down all the way to use it fully. But I'll just show you again, running real quick, how slick this actually does work with these 1" belts. They track really, really well. And there's that wheel grinding. All right, let's go take a look at this belt slitter in action. All right, so all I'll do is I'll take my little belt slitter and I just clamp into this vise for now. I was debating on whether or not I should weld it to a piece of plate, and that way I could clamp it, or even, you know, just bolt it to the side of the table, leave it a permanent fixture. Obviously you do want to watch out because that's a sharp little piece of razor blade sticking up there, but should we just crank it like this a little bit. Get her clamped in like that. It doesn't have to be super solid. There's not a lot of pressure you have to put on it. And all you do is you take your 2" wide belt and kind of hold it nice and tight there, which will center it, puncture the belt. And the key to this whole operation is to keep good pressure this way. As the belt feeds in, you want to make sure it's being guided by these 2 shoulders that we've turned. So with a decent amount of tension on there, simply give it a yank. I don't think I had a really good start on that one. And I've cut about 15 belts so far with this, and the blade could be replaced, but I mean razor blades are cheap. You can see it's struggling through that where it's joined there. Just like that. 2 belts instead of 1. All right guys, so as you can see, that little belt slitter works really, really well. I've got a bunch of belts that I've slit already behind me. Some of them are brand new, so that certain processes, you want a really fresh belt when you're finishing knives and stuff like that. I've got those ready to go. I can just throw them on my horizontal grinder and boom, I'm good to go. Also, like I mentioned before, I usually save all my old grinding belts and hand sand with them. And before I was doing it with the full 2" width. Well, now I could just slit them right down the middle, and I've got a 1" roll that is 6 feet long. And that's a great little money saving option because, you know, you consider, I was looking online this morning, and a 1" by 50-foot roll of sandpaper is usually around $30 US, plus I have to ship it or whatever. So why not use the stuff that you already have lying around that you would otherwise throw away? And especially when it's down to a 1" width, it's a lot easier to handle, and really makes putting the final finish on your knives and final profiling, shaping of your handles really nice to work with. Hope you enjoyed this video, guys. Thanks for your support. If you did like it, consider giving a thumbs up. And also, if you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing that. Feel free to share this video as you wish. The rest of this video is going to be the build footage of me making that little slitting gizmo. And I do it on a metal lathe. And I'm going to talk about a few of the processes, kind of give you some of the ideas or the thought process behind what I was doing. And it's not going to be very long. I'm just going to edit it down to a really short little couple minutes, or if that. So thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you on the next video. Cheers. Alright, so I started out with a piece of 1.25" shafting, and this was just a piece of scrap that I had laying around. And I cut that to about 4.5 inches long. And then I took it over to the lathe, I chucked it up, and I faced the one end of it off so I had a nice flat surface to start with. And I was actually quite impressed with how square the cut was right off of the cold cut chop saw, so I was pretty happy about that. And then I took a center drill and just drilled a little divot in the very end of the shaft so that my live center could mount to, and I could keep the whole issue nice and rigid while I machined it. And then I just marked out my groove where I wanted it to be, and I spaced it a 1/2 inch from the one end, and that way I had a little extra meat on the other side in case I wanted to weld it to a plate or something. And I just started out by marking where the groove is going to start and end, and I got into the machining process. One thing I realized that I'm not happy with these cutting inserts that came with my lathe that the gentleman had given me when I bought the lathe. They've got a really poor chip break design to them, so you end up with these long spaghetti strings of razor wire, and you really got to watch out with those, because when those get caught in the chuck, man, it can be pretty nasty, especially if your face is close to there. So anyways, we just kind of cleaned this up, and I brought it down to about 7/8 of an inch in diameter. And then I marked out a little line 1 inch, so right in the center of that groove. And I just took my cutting tool and made a little groove there, and that would act as my line that I would use for cutting with my bandsaw, just to make sure I got a really nice straight cut. And then I took my portable bandsaw and I cut about 60% of the way through, so a little over half, but I wanted to leave as much as I could so that it was still nice and strong. And then kind of marked out where I want that hole to be, and I drilled that out. I tapped it 1/4 and then I also ended up drilling a slightly larger hole as well, just so the upper body of the tap that I was using would have clearance in there. And then I also had to make a bottoming tap with one of my 1/4 inch taps, so I just kind of ground it flat because the regular starting taps that I had, they weren't tapping all the way down. So tested it out with a screw and it works good. And then the blades that I was using are just those cheap utility blades that have points on both ends, and I just kind of snapped it off. And I had to clean up that groove a little bit. I had a little bit of burrs in there from drilling through, and then mount it up and give it a test. I'm really happy with the way it turned out. Anyways, hopefully this might give you an idea. A slitting tool is pretty handy to have. A lot of different ways you can make it, and the results are pretty good. Thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.